Hello, this is a presentation on electrolytic remediation methods by Joey, Gabe, Hussein, and Andrew. We will first describe the principal/crucial physical mechanism by which electrokinetic remediation works. Electrolytic methods separate and extract heavy metals, radionuclides, organic contaminants from saturated or unsaturated soils, sludges, and sediments. The method works through a process called electrolysis. Electrolysis involves the separation of a substance into its original components/elements through the use of an electric current to stimulate a non-spontaneous reaction. This electric current is sent through an electrolyte and into a solution to stimulate the flow of ions and cause a chemical reaction. A simplified schematic of the electrolysis process can be seen here. In this diagram, an electric current is supplied to an anode and a cathode, which are placed in an electrolyte solution. This solution provides the medium for the exchange of electrons between the cathode and the anode. When an electric current is supplied to the circuit, a reduction reaction takes place at the cathode, resulting in the gain of electrons, which creates a negative charge. The positively charged ions in the solution will now be drawn to the negatively charged cathode. The opposite will happen to the anode. An oxidation reaction takes place, and the anode will become positively charged when an electric current is supplied, which means that negatively charged ions in the solution will be drawn to the cathode. This makes the electrolysis process an effective means for separating charged particles such as heavy metals. This process can also be upscaled for in situ remediation techniques at sites where heavy metals contamination is present. This can be seen in the following schematic. Implementation at the field scale uses the same underlying principles as the electrolytic cell discussed previously, except the contaminated soil/sludge now becomes the solution, and the charged particles are the contaminants. These contaminant species can migrate through the soil through the process of electromigration and electroosmosis. Electromigration is the migration of ionic species through the soil solution, and electroosmosis refers to the migration of the soil solution through the pore system of the soil. This soil solution may also contain dissolved pollutant species. Both of these mechanisms contribute to the transport of ionic species through the soil, but factors such as porosity, soil texture, and ionic strength of the electrolyte determine which plays a larger role in migration. It is sometimes necessary to use special approaches to convert the pollutants into mobile forms. These approaches are often based on compounds that react with the pollutant. One such method that has been studied is the use of a leaching system that is introduced into the soil through the cathode well. This leaching solution is comprised of iodide, iodate, and triiodide, and it is capable of complexing the contaminating compounds. This solution creates a potential difference between the cathode and the anode, which causes the ions in the soil to migrate until they reach the contaminating species. They will then react and form ionic, iodide-based complexes. These complexes then migrate to the anodes, where they are extracted along with the electrolytic solution. A second method for inducing migration is a process that was patented by General Electric in 1993. This process uses iodine-based solutions for complexing heavy metals dispersed in soil. The soil is washed with a solution containing elemental iodine and iodide ions. The iodine species react with the soil contaminants by forming soluble complexes, which are withheld in the complexing solution. This solution is then subjected to electrolysis to recover the heavy metals. A downside to this process is that it requires a significant consumption of chemical reagents since the complexing solution contains a high concentration of iodines and iodides. Next, we will discuss some of the factors that influence electrolytic remediation methods and its applicability. Electrolytic methods work well for remediating heavy metals such as lead, mercury, cadmium, nickel, copper, zinc, and chromium. Radioactive species such as cesium-137, strontium-90, cobalt-60, and uranium. Toxic anions such as nitrates and sulfates. Dense non-aqueous phase liquids, also known as DNAPLs. Cyanides, petroleum hydrocarbons such as diesel fuel, gasoline, kerosene, and lubricating oils. Explosives, mixed organic/ionic contaminants. Halogenated hydrocarbons such as TCE, non-halogenated organic pollutants such as PTEX, and polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons. Electromigration rates in the subsurface depend upon grain size, ionic mobility, contamination concentration, total ionic concentration, and the density of the soil pore water. The process is not as dependent on the fluid permeability of soil as it is on the pore water electrical conductivity and path length through the soil, both of which are a function of soil moisture content. The direction and quantity of the contaminant movement is influenced by the contaminant concentration, anions versus cations, soil type, soil structure, interfacial chemistry, and current density of the soil pore water. Electrolytic methods can be used in saturated or unsaturated soil. However, experimental results indicate that there is a minimum moisture content at which electromigration can occur. This is related to and can be estimated from the residual moisture content of the soil. This is referred to as immobile water. Electromigration will only occur if the soil moisture content is high enough, but the optimum level of soil moisture content should be less than saturation to avoid the competing effects of tortuosity and pore water content. The efficiency of extraction relies on several factors, such as the type of species, their solubility in the specific soil, their electrical charge, their concentration relative to other species, their location in the soil, their form in the soil, and amount of organic matter available in the soil. Aquifers with zones of low hydraulic conductivity and high clay content are where electrolytic processes are most applicable. A low cation exchange capacity and low salinity also increase the efficiency of the technology. Various field and laboratory screening tests are conducted to determine the physical characteristics of the aquifer that either limit the applicability of the method or which make the method particularly useful. Field electrical conductivity surveys are used to delineate the natural special conductivity variance because buried metallic or insulating material can induce variability in the electrical conductivity of the soil, and therefore the voltage gradient. It is also important to assess if there are deposits that exhibit very high electrical conductivity levels, as this could make electrokinetic remediation inefficient. The pH and electrical conductivity of the pore water should be determined because the pH has an effect on the valence, solubility, and sorption of contaminant ions. This test also helps to determine the efficiency of electrokinetic remediation. A chemical analysis of the pore water should be conducted to locate major dissolved anions and cations and to assess the predicted concentration of contaminants. Finally, the buffering capacity, cation exchange capacity, and salinity of the soil should be analyzed to also aid in the determination of the effectiveness of electrolytic processes.
Next, we will discuss how electrolytic methods are implemented in the field. A standard electrokinetic setup looks similar to the figure on the right. There are several key components to each electrokinetic in situ contaminant treatment unit. Electrical current is supplied by the direct current, or DC, power supply. The electrical current creates a voltage gradient that is the driving force for the process. There are two electrodes, the anode and the cathode, spaced apart in the soil at either end of the contaminated zone. In this particular figure, the cathode is made of lead cations and the anode is made of chromium chromate anions. The electrodes are at the bottom of two wells drilled into the contaminated zone, which are parallel to each other. Pumps are not present in this figure, but they are placed at each well to pump the solution containing the contaminants out of the ground and into the solution treatment units. The solution treatment units are located above the ground surface and are used to treat the contaminants as they are pumped out of each well. When designing an electrolytic system, there are a few important parameters to consider. The electrodes are typically made from carbon, graphite, or platinum. However, any inert material is acceptable for this because the key to the design is to minimize reactions at the electrode. Because if the electrode plates reacted, they would just create more pollution. The power supply should use direct current, as previously mentioned, and the current should be at least 1 amp per square foot between the electrodes. Required power will depend on the site in question, but usually varies between 50 and 250 kilowatt hours. The wells are usually cased with ceramic material, again, to prevent the corrosion of the electrodes. Spacing between the wells is usually between 2 and 7 feet apart, as you can see in the image in the upper right corner. That image is an above-ground view of many electrolytic cells in rows ready to remove contamination. And that is an example of what it can look like in the field itself. As discussed earlier, electromigration is the movement of charged, dissolved ions through an aqueous medium towards electrodes with opposite polarity. This is the process that occurs during the more traditional, so to speak, electrolytic extraction apparatuses. This process is used a lot because electrolytic methods are often used when there are charged contaminants dissolved in an aqueous medium in the soil that need to be removed. The voltage gradient is established, and anions move to the anode, with cations moving towards the cathode. The rate at which this occurs will depend on the experimental setup, which depends on the parameters discussed in the previous slide and the parameters of the aquifer itself, such as the porosity and soil types, as already discussed. But at its core, the process looks about the same if the site is being cleaned up using electrokinetic extraction. But if the electrolytic system uses electroosmosis, on the other hand, the system will look slightly different than what has been previously discussed, though the basic principle is the same. As previously mentioned, during electroosmosis, movement of both fluid and dissolved components occurs. The movement of the fluid itself changes the setup required to implement an electroosmotic system. It changes it by adding a fresh water supply to the well with the anode and a drainage system to the well with the cathode, as you can see in the image. The reason why the water supply is added to the well containing the anode specifically is because most soil particles are negatively charged, which attracts cations into the soil to line the boundary of the porous medium. Water molecules then align around the cations, with any remaining water molecules completing the boundary layer around the cations and the negatively charged soil surface. Now, the water molecules aligned with the cations are on the outside of the medium and are positively charged due to their close proximity to the dissolved cations. So, when the electric field is applied, these positively charged water molecules will move towards the negatively charged cathode. As the cations move through the porous medium at a relatively high velocity, a shearing action occurs as they pull the water molecules towards the cathode. So, over time, enough water will be pulled towards the cathode that the system would cease to accomplish its goal because the anions in the porous medium that are moving the opposite direction of the water would run out of water to move through before making it to the anode. Additionally, cations that happen to start close to the anode might be left behind if the water moves far enough away quickly to the cathode that those cations are left behind. At the cathode, water will of course build up over time, so it must be drained so that the movement of water molecules behind the buildup layer will reach the cathode, and so the water supply at the cathode, or rather, so that the water supply at the anode doesn't spill out onto the surface. Otherwise, the cations removed are treated at the water treatment unit at the cathode, while the anions removed are treated at the water treatment unit at the anode, just as in the electrolytic system, which uses electromigration. An emerging electrolytic technology used in the field is electrokinetic amendment distribution. Rather than using the electric field to remove contaminants at the electrode, this system uses electromigration to distribute remedial amendments to the soil in situ. As shown in the figure on the right, select reagents are added to the electrode wells from the surface. The reagents then travel through the soil in the same way that the charged particles do in the quote-unquote traditional method of electrolytic remediation, but these particles have of course been intentionally injected into the soil to clean up contaminants. In the case of the figure, this is the contaminants are a plume of dissolved contaminant of some sort. So the reagents are taking contaminants with them as they move through the soil down the charge gradient. It's also worth noting that in this setup, there are 3 electrodes rather than 2. In this case, the amendment is lactate, which is negatively charged. That means that there will be 2 cathodes on the outside of the system at either end, with an anode in the middle to attract the lactate to the center. This creates 2 electrolytic cells back to back, with lactate converging at the anode of both. This is where the lactate and the dissolved contaminants that it picks up along the way will be removed. Another notable feature of this method is that the heat generated at the electrodes can facilitate contaminant dispersion, which makes it easier for them to attach to the amendments.
Electrolytic methods was used successfully in the rich sites. Thus, we will discuss about the 4 case studies that has already been used for the method. Our first case study is in the Department of Energy Paducah Gaseous Division Plant in Kentucky. The Paducah plant was involved with the first nuclear weapons program in the United States, and later became the only gaseous division uranium enrichment plant in the country, leading to the production of hazardous and radioactive wastes that contaminate the soil, ground, and surface water in the site over 50 years. A pilot study was conducted between January and May 1995 to assess the electrokinetic effects of using in situ methods, including electrokinetic remediation, to address the trichloroethylene or TCE contamination in the soil at the site. Electroosmotic remediation was able to attain 99.7% effectiveness in removing TCE in its free phase, with minimal emissions and a voltage gradient of 0.25 volts per centimeter, resulting in a water speed of 0.43 centimeter per day. The technique costs approximately $80 per cubic yard for a 45-foot deep quarter-acre site. Our second study is in the Quick-Res industrial site in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. The site had high levels of TCE, including DNAPA levels, in saturated clay and slit soil, extending under the nearby river bed and requiring decontamination of half of the Fond du Lac River. Initial soil sampling revealed substantial DNAPA concentrations higher than estimated during the design phase, with some areas exceeding 1,000 milligrams per kilogram. The remediation project started with 2 anodes and 1 cathode, and the installations took 3 weeks. The electrical and recycling plumbing took an additional 2 weeks to complete. The system was initially exposed to 208 volts and produced a DC output of approximately 190 to 500 ampere. The project lasted over 2 years until 2008 and was remotely monitored, saving operational costs, but funding for the site was eliminated in 2009 due to the deteriorating economic conditions of the state. Post-treatment sampling showed reduced DNAPA concentrations after funding was stopped, indicating that the treatment had been effective in removing TCE. Although the target contaminated levels were not reached, more than 2/3 of the TCE was removed. The zones of DNAPA diminished and the remaining iron fillings would continue to contain any TCE that might migrate across by division or convection for years to come. The next case study is in Naval Air Weapons Station, or NAWS, Point Mogo, California. The NAWS site in Ventura County, California, previously used for electroplanting and metal finishing operations, contained unlined waste lagoons that received 95 million gallons of planting, rinds solution, and other waste materials, including 60,000 gallons of photographic fixer solution, and rocket fuel. In 1994, high levels of cadmium and chromium were detected in surface samples from the lagoons, exceeding California's allowable standards. Prior to remediation, various laboratory tests were conducted on soil samples from the site, including tests for contaminants, soil characteristics, pH, TCLP, cation exchange capacity, hydraulic condition, among others. The results of laboratory study showed that the purpose method of remediation using electromigration was feasible and effective for the site. Pinch scales tests were not effective in protecting the actual effects of the remediation process, especially with respect to competing ions and contaminant transport. The technology was also ineffective in meeting the performance goals of bringing down contaminants to regulatory levels. The technology had an adverse effect on organic contaminants in the soil, which increased during the process. Additionally, the transport of electrokinetically mobilized contaminants in confined and unconfined areas was not accessed due to poor performance during the demonstration. The last case study is in the Greek Bed, U.S. Army firing range, Louisiana. The site is contaminated with lead, which can cause various health issues such as digestive problems, neurological problems, high blood pressure, and kidney dysfunction. A comprehensive study was carried out in collaboration with the Department of Defense, WES, and Electrokinetics. In 1996, to assess the lead contamination at the site, which found that some areas had very high levels of lead reaching almost 4,500 milligram per kilogram. In 1993, a pilot-scale laboratory testing was conducted to remove 2,000 milligram per kilogram of lead from collinant soil using the CAD-EXTM electrode system. The removal efficiency varied between 90 to 95% and within 30 weeks. Lead concentrations decreased to less than 300 milligram per kilogram and TCLP values dropped to less than 40 milligram per liter. The success of the process may vary depending on the soil or the soil type, with high levels of calcium or magnesium impacting removal and clay slowing down the movement of contaminants. Full-scale efficiency and cost-effectiveness have not been evaluated yet.
Applicability and limitations. Applicability. Electrolytic methods of remediation can be used on a wide range of contaminants and can easily be adjusted for the specific target contaminants. These methods can also be used to remediate soil and just about any other kinds of porous media. It has shown to work a lot better at remediating saturated soils rather than unsaturated soils. Remediation can be done in situ or ex situ, but in situ saves the costs of having to transport the soil. It is very easy to target specific areas because the remediation reactions occur between the anode and cathode. Limitations. The efficiency may decrease if there is a lot of other contaminants or other ionic compounds other than what is specifically being targeted. The electrolytic reactions cause the pH in the soil to decrease and it can become very acidic. It is a lot more efficient in soils that have low hydraulic conductivities rather than high conductivity. Contaminants must also be water soluble, so sometimes they may need to add some kind of reagent to assist in dissolving the contaminants. Cost and availability. Electrolytic methods of remediation are estimated to cost between $44 and $130 per ton, but the prices may vary depending on what is being treated and whether they're doing it in situ or ex situ. From the chart, you can tell that as you increase the amount of time that you are remediating for, the cost generally tends to decrease, not increase as people would expect it to.